a more general way about arguments than Rachel does in his piece, Basic Points About Arguments. In the second lecture, I'll go through Rachel's particular article more specifically. But right now, I just want to paint a broader context. So what am I going to talk about then? Well, specifically, I'm going to start off by just telling you what I think arguments are. Then I'll give you some functions that arguments serve, reasons why we use arguments, and why we should care about it. Then we'll talk about how arguments actually work, and we'll break arguments down into elements of the particular argument and the structural arrangement that an argument arranges those elements into. Then we'll look at two different kinds of arguments. We'll look at deductive arguments, which Rachel discusses in his piece, and we'll look at inductive arguments, which Rachel doesn't really discuss, but which are equally important. Finally, we'll summarize what we've covered in the lecture. So what are arguments? Well, as Rachel notices, right, oftentimes when we think about arguments, we think about scenarios like this, right? Use that. No, use that. Right? But this isn't what philosophers, mathematicians, logicians, and so on think of when we think about arguments, right? As Homer would say, well, Homer would never actually use words like this, but this is just practice rhetoric, right? These are just sniping at each other, verbal disputes that don't have a particular purpose or methodology. And arguments do. They have a purpose and a methodology. So what are arguments then? Well, arguments are artifacts. Now, when I tell students that, sometimes I think they think what Homer here is thinking, right? That means arguments are old and that no one cares about them. But that's not true. There's Bertrand Russell. He was a British philosopher and a tremendous mathematician and logician, right? And he's here to tell you what I think arguments really are, right? Arguments are human creations. They're tools. They're products of human artifice. And like all tools, right, arguments are created for specific purposes. And arguments are integral and important to human civilization. In fact, humans have even created multiple sciences to study how best to make and to use arguments. Those sciences include formal deductive logic, mathematics, statistics, and probability theory. So, arguments are artifacts. They're human creations. Right? What else can we say about arguments then? Well, arguments are structured collections of statements. Right? There are multiple statements, and they are structured in a particular way. So, why is it that I think arguments are so important? Why is it that people have been using arguments? And why is it that people should care about creating and consuming arguments? What possible purposes could they serve? Well, I'm going to point to 4 different purposes that I think arguments serve and why I think they've become so fundamental and integral to the intellectual development of humankind. First of all, arguments allow us to present our thinking. An argument will create for the consumer of that argument a model of an inference. It'll present the argument creator's thinking to the consumer, right? And it will do so in a rigorous, comprehensible, and compelling fashion, right? And because it's rigorous, comprehensible, and compelling, arguments are also great vehicles for persuading other people, getting them to follow along the same route of inference that you took. Arguments also provide you with a vehicle for preserving a line of thought for yourself across time or for other people through time. And finally, arguments allow us an ability to analyze and refine our thinking in a way that we usually have very great difficulty doing just using our own train of thought, right? And so let's go and look at each of these in a little more detail then. What about arguments as vehicles for presentation and persuasion? Right? Well, verbal and written arguments, I think, facilitate presentation and persuasion really in 2 ways. Right? First, Arguments organize information in a manner that minimizes the challenges posed by the limitations that we find inherent in human working memory. Human working memory is incredibly small. And because human working memory is incredibly small, people have great difficulty processing large amounts of information or highly complex information consciously using their working memory. Right? They make lots of errors. Information gets lost. They don't do a good job of making appropriate inferences and so on. Right? But arguments organize and streamline that information. They provide a model, a roadmap for an inference so that you can present it effectively to someone in a persuasive form. So they model a relationship between evidence, right, between facts, knowledge, shared assumptions, and something that is thought to be made more likely to be true or guaranteed to be true given that evidence. And it shows that relationship. It models it for the consumer of the argument. Verbal and written arguments also facilitate presentation and persuasion by explicitly identifying potential inferences and formalizing them. That is, putting them into a standard format and formulating them in accordance with a standard set of rules, right? Rules that have come to be recognized as being good rules, rules that facilitate good inferences. So statistics is an example of a science that's developed good rules. Deductive logic is another example of a science that has developed good rules. So if I give you an argument, and that argument has true premises that you accept as true, and it is deductively valid, it's a good deductive argument, right? It follows the rules of deductive logic, right? Then there's a normative force behind the conclusion, so that if those premises are true and you acknowledge that they're true, right, the conclusion is guaranteed to be true. And if you then reject the conclusion, right, you're rejecting our rules about what counts as a good or a bad inference, right? And I'm right to sort of accuse you of being irrational about this. I'm saying, look, if these things are true, this has to be true. And there's a force to that that's more than just convincing. It is normative in nature. It says, look, you need to adhere to these agreed upon rules. What about presentation and evaluation? Well, written arguments especially, but also verbal tradition, right? But particularly written arguments serve this vital function. They transfer that information, those potential inferences from our brain, from our working memory, to an external long-term memory, like a piece of paper or a computer file, right? And this transfer then allows for greater permanence for the modeled inferences, and that facilitates preservation for ourselves and for others across time. So you can go to the library, you can go down to the philosophy section, you could pull a book off the shelf, right? You could pull off, say, The Republic by Plato, open it up, and there you'd find arguments that had been encoded, written down by Plato, right, over 2,300 years ago, that have been preserved by people through time. It is part of our cultural heritage, this stuff. By transferring our inferences, our information to these external long-term memories, right? That also lightens our cognitive load. It allows humans to free up their working memory. So you can now look at the argument without it consuming all your working memory. And that really helps people in refining, formulating, making the best version of the argument they can, and really importantly, in terms of evaluating the argument. Is this a good argument or a bad argument? Are the premises true, for example? Do the premises, in fact, really have the relationship to the conclusion that is suggested by the argument, or is it not a good argument? Right? The ability to evaluate arguments is an incredibly important advance in human thinking, and it's facilitated by our ability to write them down, to encode them in a way that allows us then to free up our working memory for the purposes of refining and evaluating. So now we've talked a little bit about what arguments are, talked a little bit about the sorts of functions that arguments serve. Right? Now let's talk about how it is that arguments actually achieve their stated goals. Right? And we'll do that by starting off with talking about how it is that anyone could create an argument. Arguments, as our friend Bertrand Russell here will tell us, are just structured collections of statements. So let's start by figuring out what it is to be a statement. So a statement is an expression in a language that's capable of being true or false. Right? It's an accurate representation of the world or an inaccurate representation of the world. So any given language has lots and lots of expressions that count as statements. So if I were to say, you are now taking philosophy 160 from Cal State Long Beach, right? That's a statement. It could be true. It could be false. In this case, it would be true. Right? If I were to say that Mount Everest is the tallest mountain in the Rocky Mountains, that's also a statement. It says something about the world. In this case, it says something that is false about the world. So statements are expressions in language that describe the world in a way that's either accurate or inaccurate. Now, not every expression in a language is in fact a statement. Right? So if I were to ask you, say, how do you get to Cal State Long Beach? You wouldn't be responding in a coherent or appropriate fashion by saying, oh, true. Yeah, definitely true. Right? If I were to say, look out, you shouldn't say, false. You should duck or move. Right? So lots of expressions in our language aren't statements, but many, many, many are. Every statement, right, has what logicians, mathematicians, and so on call a truth value. That is, whether it's true or false. So, for example, way back in the day when Bill Clinton said, oh, I did not have sex with that woman, right? That was a statement. Happened to be false, right? When George W. Bush said that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction immediately prior to the most recent U.S. invasion, that was a statement, and it was false as well, right? So statements have truth values. That is, they are either true or they're false, and whether they're true or false is what their truth value actually is. Both of the statements I just discussed were, in fact, statements that had a false truth value. Truth values are just binary values in philosophy and logic. Right? They indicate whether or not a statement accurately models some part of the world. Right? So if I say I rolled a 3, and you look down at the face of the die, and it's got 6 dots on it, that statement is false. If I say I rolled a 6, and you look down at the die, and it's got 6 dots on it, that statement is true.